During the season of creation, while we're letting the trees teach us, our first lesson will be, in one way or another, an opportunity to hear from some trees. Today, we listen to the oak trees. There are around 500 species of oak trees across the world. About 90 of those species of oak trees are native to North America, and at least 10 of those are native to California. When I was doing my research for the interpretation of this passage, I came across something in the Working Preacher which added that this passage is often seen as transactional. If Abraham and Sarah were to show God love and give generous love to God, then they would be bestowed upon them a son. And so I just sort of, on a surface read, have a tendency to think of God as transactional. If I do something for God, God will do something for me. And as a Roman Catholic in my journey, when I was in fourth grade, I learned, thought to myself, if I do something, then if I do good, I will go to heaven. And so I just note that because a deeper interpretation, why I'm so glad to be a Protestant, is that grace is freely given by God. And so I just point that out, especially the conditional verse in verse 3 of if. And on with the lesson, of course. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 10. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And Abraham said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him.
Growing up, I had a decided preference of maple trees over oak trees. The fact that maple syrup comes from sugar maple trees probably had something to do with that preference. Maple seeds are fun to watch as they fall in the spring. They're like little helicopters that twist and catch the breeze. And acorns just drop. They might as well be little stones. Acorns can hurt to walk on in bare feet. Not as much as Lego, maybe, but it can hurt to step on an acorn. And it was no picnic in my childhood going out back to hang the swim towels on the line to dry in bare feet, because there were all kinds of acorns on the ground. In autumn, maple trees provide, at least in New England, a much brighter, vibrant set of colors than oak trees. That probably influenced my preference for maple trees over oak trees too. It was actually moving here to Fremont that made me start to appreciate oak trees a bit more. First, I learned that they were a vital food source for the Ohlone people, the first peoples on this land. I would never have looked at an acorn and thought, oh, if we just shuck it and soak it and grind it up, or this is not a cooking show, maybe it's grind it up and then soak it, I'm not sure. But I never would have thought either way of, oh, this is a great way to make sure that we have got a food source. But somebody did, somebody figured that out, and they could make culinary use of it. Step 2 in my growth of my appreciation of oak trees came when Abby, a high school friend, came for a visit. We went for a hike out in the Sonol Regional Wilderness, and we saw trees filled with holes that had been stuffed with acorns, which totally baffled us. Never saw that back east growing up. And we wondered what the heck it was. We took pictures. I couldn't find any pictures that I took. She was on the wrong continent to look for her pictures. But I found this one on the net. And this is what it looked like. Just hole next to hole next to hole next to hole with all these acorns stuffed in it. What the heck is going on here? Now, I'm sure some of you know exactly what's going on here. But I didn't, she didn't. She asked her husband, who is an avid birder, and he knew immediately that this is the acorn woodpecker doing its thing, collecting its resources.
When other foods are scarce, acorns will be here, safe in their shells and ready to eat. This is prosperity for the family. a true measure of wealth. But wealth, it turns out, is a whole lot of work. Now, they constantly test and turn the acorns as they dry and shrink to make sure each one is still snug in its hole. If the hole seems too big, they look for a better fit, tapping the acorn back in tight. It's a process fraught with difficult decisions. And an acorn dropped could be lost forever.
The support that oak trees provide acorn woodpeckers and many other animals is just one example of why I continue to grow in my appreciation of oak trees. The little factoids I provided during our threshold moment moving us into worship are an example of that, that valley oak trees have been documented to support 300 animal species, 1,100 plants, 370 fungi, 716 lichens, 5,000 insects and invertebrate species, that they can host hundreds of species of caterpillar when chestnut trees host 4. A stand of oak trees becomes its own biodiversity hotspot. Oak trees are the master tree species when it comes to hospitality. According to Genesis, Abraham and Sarah also appreciated the hospitality of oak trees. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their roots back to Abraham and Sarah. Here we are thousands of years later, and we find ourselves as branches and leaves of Abraham and Sarah's still living tree. Abraham is the only person described in the Hebrew scriptures as being a friend of God. Where, we might wonder, did Abraham learn such intimacy with God? If we read the Abraham story from the perspective of the trees, we may find that out. Daniel Cooper Ryder does that kind of reflecting. Almost immediately when God started appearing to Abraham, these appearances tended to happen in the presence of trees. Following God's call to wander into an unknown land, Abraham finds himself pausing under the oak of Morah. It's in Genesis 12. It was here that God appeared to Abraham and declared that this land would be for him and his ancestors. Abraham had entered the Holy Land, the landscape of the soul, and its entrance was marked by a tree. Abraham built his first altar to God under that oak tree. In the next chapter, Genesis 13, God calls Abraham to explore this new landscape. Abraham sets off exploring and finally ends up at a more permanent camp under the oaks of Mamre. Likely a rural spot on the West Bank desert, the oaks of Mamre would prove to be a favorite camping spot for Abraham and Sarah. From there, they continued their wanderings, and by the time we get to Genesis 18, the chapter we heard our reading from today, they've returned to this campsite. And there, under the special oak trees, God appears to Abraham again, and in perhaps the most dramatic and theologically decisive way of his life. It does not seem a coincidence to me that this foundational biblical text on hospitality takes place in the shade of the hospitable oak tree. Abraham is resting in the shade of the oak trees in the heat of the day. He's enjoying the microclimate that the communities of trees can create. Talmud claims that when those three strangers arrived, Abraham was in prayer, talking to God. But when they arrived, he stopped the conversation with God and offered them hospitality. This shows, the Talmud argues, that extending hospitality to the stranger is even more important than our private conversations with God. Or perhaps we might think of it this way: extending hospitality to the stranger is the conversation God is always eager to be having with us. It seems as if Abraham is on the lookout for the strangers passing by. He doesn't wait for them to ask if he's got a glass of water to quench their thirst. Instead, he goes to them. He runs to them in the heat of the day and invites them to share the cool of the oak trees. "Let me get you a little bit of water," he says. "Let me bring a little bread while you rest yourselves under the trees." That turns out to be one of the bigger understatements in the Bible. Sarah uses at least 3 days' worth of the finest grade of flour to bake the best bread, while Abraham prepares a choice calf and prepares his best dairy that he has access to. Just a little water and just a little bread, it said, before spreading out before his visitors a lavish field-to-table feast, all set under the cooling shade of those oak trees. One ancient rabbi tried to explain Abraham's understatement here by noting that when it comes to hospitality, the righteous one speaks little, but does much. We might wonder, since this is indeed the first moment of extravagant hospitality described in the Bible, where or how did Abraham and Sarah learn to extend such a gracious welcome to others? Of course, one traditional answer is located in this story within the anthropological context of the practices of the nomadic desert Bedouin culture. The ancient law of the desert, as it was known, teaches that in such a harsh landscape, a social contract to practice hospitality was a matter of life and death. On any journey, one could find oneself as the thirsty, hungry, tired wanderer, dependent on the generosity of others to survive the night. And for those providing the hospitality in the landscape in which visitors could be few and far between, the chance to host is the chance to connect with the outside world and to learn the news of the day. Outside visitors allow the host to remember and retell the story of who they are, and so to keep the ember of their identity glowing. More often than not, hospitality proves to be a mutual gift. The three strangers receive an extravagant welcome, some cooling shade, and a gourmet meal. But Sarah and Abraham receive a gift of inestimable value, a promise that even in their old age, they'll be blessed with a child. They realized the full theological truth of hospitality, that to welcome strangers, they are in fact welcoming God into their midst without even knowing it. To offer food and rest, they learned the ethical wisdom that the other person's material needs are very often my spiritual needs. As helpful as this ancient law of the desert theory is in interpreting the text, there seems to be something more going on here than mere survival. The reason this text has developed into such a strong, deep root is that the hospitality of Abraham and Sarah show truly is extravagant. They go above and beyond. They go the proverbial extra mile. Again, we might wonder, where did they learn the wisdom of such extravagant hospitality? I think about those oak trees they so loved to camp beneath. What might Abraham and Sarah have learned from living in such close proximity to those trees, the oaks of Mamre? Waking up to the sound of bird songs in the canopy, laughing at the squirrels tossing in the branches and stashing away acorns for future use, marveling at the timeless mystery of how something so small as an acorn can turn into something so grand and majestic as a mature oak tree. Watching at dusk as other animals like deer and turkey come to feed off the abundant mast. In some sense, this story is told again and again throughout the Bible. Offering hospitality is one of the grand themes and threads of Scripture. Time and again, the prophets hold the nation to account for failing to welcome the strangers, for failing to extend hospitality. Jesus lifts up the importance of welcoming the stranger, of feeding the hungry, and giving drink to the thirsty in his parable of the judgment of the nations recorded in Matthew 25. The letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament gives us a poetic and concise interpretation. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. And the Quran thinks so highly of this story, it retells it 3 times. I called this sermon Practicing Oak Ethics, because like Sarah and Abraham, we can learn from the oaks about the practice of hospitality. Hospitality to our human neighbors, and hospitality to all of God's creatures. Amen.